Have you ever wondered why desire often feels more powerful than love? Why the relationships that consume people emotionally are rarely the healthiest ones? Why calm love feels boring to wounded hearts, while emotional chaos feels intoxicating? Carl Jung understood something most people spend their entire lives misunderstanding. Desire is often not born from love at all. It is born from absence, from projection, from the unconscious hunger to reclaim lost parts of the self through another person. And that hunger can feel stronger than love itself, because love brings peace, but desire awakens longing. There is something psychologically addictive about wanting what feels emotionally incomplete. The human psyche becomes obsessed not with what is fully possessed, but with what remains uncertain, unavailable, or emotionally unresolved. This is why emotionally painful relationships often feel more intense than emotionally healthy ones. Intensity is mistaken for depth. Obsession is mistaken for connection. And emotional suffering is mistaken for passion. But beneath desire often hides something far darker than romance. Lack. Carl Jung believed human beings unconsciously project hidden needs onto romantic partners. A man does not merely desire a woman physically. He desires what she symbolizes psychologically: emotional safety, validation, power, healing, freedom, redemption. The feminine becomes container for unconscious longing. And the more emotionally fragmented the psyche becomes, the stronger desire intensifies. This is why emotionally unavailable people often create the deepest obsession. The uncertainty activates projection endlessly. The mind fills emotional distance with fantasy, meaning, hope. What cannot be fully accessed psychologically becomes emotionally magnified. Now desire begins feeding itself, not through reality, through imagination. You can see this everywhere. The man ignored by a woman suddenly becomes consumed by her. The emotionally inconsistent relationship feels impossible to leave. The unavailable partner feels more emotionally significant than the loyal one offering stable love freely. Because the unconscious mind confuses emotional tension with emotional value, and tension stimulates desire more powerfully than peace ever could. This is the hidden tragedy beneath modern relationships. Many people no longer recognize love because they became neurologically attached to emotional chaos. Calmness feels unfamiliar. Predictability feels emotionally flat. Stability feels less stimulating than uncertainty. But desire rooted in emotional instability is not intimacy. It is nervous system activation. Carl Jung understood that unresolved wounds intensify attraction dramatically. People often desire those who reactivate childhood emotional patterns unconsciously. Emotional neglect, inconsistency, fear of abandonment, shame, validation, hunger. The nervous system becomes addicted to emotional unpredictability because unpredictability feels psychologically familiar. This is why some people crave relationships, destroying them emotionally. Not because suffering is beautiful, because suffering feels known. And the familiar feels safe, even when painful. The emotionally integrated woman eventually understands this dynamic deeply. She stops romanticizing intensity automatically. She recognizes that obsessive desire often emerges strongest where emotional wounds remain unhealed. The men obsessed with her are not always in love with her reality. Sometimes they are addicted to what she awakens inside them psychologically. Fantasy, longing, emotional hunger, projection. This realization changes feminine energy profoundly. Now she becomes more discerning with attention, She stops confusing pursuit with emotional depth, stops believing obsession automatically means genuine love. Because obsession can emerge from ego wounds just as easily as authentic connection. In fact, ego-driven desire often feels far more intense initially because ego desires possession, love desires presence. There is enormous difference. Desire rooted in ego fears loss constantly. It seeks reassurance compulsively. It becomes emotionally consumed by uncertainty. The ego wants to capture what it believes will complete it psychologically. But love does not seek completion through control. Love flows from wholeness. And wholeness feels quieter than obsession. This is why emotionally mature relationships sometimes feel less intoxicating initially. Healthy love does not constantly activate fear, insecurity, longing, or emotional survival instincts. Instead, it creates safety, stability, emotional rest. But wounded nervous systems often interpret emotional rest as lack of chemistry, because chaos became associated with passion. The Stoics understood this clearly. Seneca warned that uncontrolled desire enslaves the mind. The more emotionally dependent a person becomes upon external stimulation, the less peace they experience internally. Desire without consciousness becomes psychological imprisonment. And modern relationships are filled with imprisoned people calling their chains love. The hidden reason desire feels stronger than love is because desire often feeds the wounded ego, while love requires transcending it. Desire says, complete me. Love says, meet me. And only one of these creates peace. Peace, however, feels terrifying to people addicted to emotional intensity. The nervous system conditioned by chaos does not immediately trust calmness. It searches for hidden danger inside silence. It mistakes emotional stability for emotional emptiness. This is why many people sabotage healthy love unconsciously, while chasing relationships that wound them repeatedly. The wounded psyche craves activation more than connection. Carl Jung believed unconscious patterns govern attraction far more than people realize consciously. Human beings do not merely fall in love with people. They fall in love with emotional experiences mirroring unresolved psychological wounds. The emotionally unavailable partner often awakens childhood longing. The inconsistent lover recreates familiar emotional instability. The emotionally distant person activates the ancient hunger to finally feel chosen. And the more painful the longing becomes, the stronger desire often feels. Not because the connection is deeper, because the wound is deeper. This is the hidden mechanism behind obsession. Obsession feeds upon emotional incompleteness. It thrives inside uncertainty, distance, inconsistency, fantasy. The ego becomes addicted to the emotional chase because the chase promises eventual validation. If this person finally loves you completely, perhaps the emptiness inside will disappear. But emptiness never disappears through possession. This is why desire rooted in projection eventually collapses under reality. The fantasy cannot survive authentic intimacy forever. Once another person becomes emotionally available consistently, projection weakens. Reality replaces imagination. The nervous system loses the addictive tension keeping obsession alive. And suddenly, people say something tragic. The spark disappeared. But often the spark was anxiety, not love. The emotionally integrated woman begins recognizing this distinction clearly. She understands why some men desire her most intensely when she becomes emotionally unavailable, why silence creates obsession, why distance magnifies attraction. Because emotional scarcity activates projection powerfully inside the masculine psyche, especially inside emotionally fragmented men. Carl Jung understood that projection transforms people into symbols. The desired woman becomes more than herself psychologically. She becomes fantasy, redemption, validation, escape from inner emptiness. The less accessible she feels emotionally, the larger she grows inside the unconscious mind. Now desire no longer concerns reality. It concerns imagination. And imagination can become intoxicating enough to overpower genuine love completely. This is why emotionally chaotic relationships often feel unforgettable. The nervous system becomes conditioned through intermittent emotional reward. Moments of closeness followed by withdrawal create psychological addiction, similar to gambling. Uncertainty intensifies emotional fixation. The ego keeps chasing resolution, hoping the next emotional high will finally create peace. But it never does. Because desire without emotional integration creates endless hunger. The Stoics warned repeatedly about this trap. Epictetus taught that uncontrolled attachment to external desires creates suffering because the mind becomes emotionally dependent upon things it can't fully control. Desire enslaves people when identity becomes attached to emotional outcomes. And modern love is filled with enslaved hearts, people confusing emotional suffering with destiny, confusing obsession with soul connection, confusing anxiety with chemistry. This confusion becomes especially dangerous for women who derive self-worth through being intensely desired. Many women unconsciously mistake masculine obsession for emotional depth. The more emotionally consumed a man appears, the more valuable the connection seems psychologically. But obsession can emerge from insecurity just as easily as love. A man emotionally addicted to uncertainty may pursue women intensely without possessing emotional capacity for genuine intimacy. He desires the emotional high of pursuit more than the reality of connection itself. Once closeness becomes stable, desire weakens because the ego no longer receives the stimulation of emotional tension. This is why some men lose interest once they have someone emotionally. The chase fed desire, peace exposed emptiness. The emotionally awakened woman eventually stops worshiping desire itself. She stops needing obsession to feel valuable, stops interpreting emotional chaos as proof of depth. She realizes genuine love often enters quietly, calmly, without destroying nervous system stability constantly. And this realization transforms feminine energy profoundly. Now she becomes emotionally selective. She no longer confuses intensity for intimacy. She watches for consistency instead of emotional fireworks alone. She values emotional safety alongside attraction rather than choosing one against the other. Because true feminine power is not the ability to trigger obsession endlessly. It is the ability to recognize when obsession is merely wounded desire wearing the mask of love. Carl Jung believed individuation requires confronting unconscious emotional patterns honestly. The integrated woman confronts her own attraction to emotional chaos consciously. She notices when desire emerges strongest around emotionally unavailable men, notices when longing intensifies around uncertainty, notices how fantasy can overpower reality psychologically. And once consciousness enters desire, illusion begins dissolving. As illusion dissolves, something uncomfortable begins happening inside the psyche. The relationships once experienced as passionate suddenly reveal themselves differently. The obsession no longer feels romantic. It feels exhausting. The emotional highs lose their magic because consciousness now recognizes the nervous system beneath the fantasy. And once the unconscious becomes conscious, desire changes permanently. Carl Jung believed awareness transforms emotional patterns more powerfully than force ever could. A person trapped unconsciously inside desire remains controlled by it, but a person who sees desire clearly begins separating authentic love from psychological addiction. This distinction changes everything, because authentic love does not constantly threaten emotional survival. It nourishes, it steadies, it expands the soul rather than consuming it entirely. But wounded people often distrust this kind of love initially, because healthy connection lacks the emotional volatility they unconsciously associate with passion. Calmness feels suspicious. Emotional availability feels emotionally flat. The absence of anxiety feels like absence of chemistry. This is the tragedy of unresolved emotional wounds. People become addicted to emotional activation instead of emotional truth. You can watch this pattern unfold repeatedly inside modern relationships. A woman feels deeply drawn toward the emotionally distant man who keeps her guessing. The inconsistency intensifies longing. Every small moment of affection feels euphoric, precisely because emotional certainty remains unavailable. Meanwhile, the emotionally grounded man offering consistency may feel less exciting. Not because he lacks depth, because he does not activate survival instincts. Carl Jung understood that many attractions are not expressions of love, but repetitions of unresolved emotional history. The psyche seeks familiar pain, hoping this time it will finally resolve differently. This is why emotionally neglected individuals often desire emotionally unavailable partners unconsciously. The nervous system mistakes emotional deprivation for emotional significance, and desire intensifies around deprivation. This mechanism explains why longing can feel more powerful than fulfillment itself. Longing allows fantasy to remain alive. Reality eventually limits fantasy. Real intimacy exposes flaws, vulnerability, emotional responsibility. But desire built upon distance remains psychologically perfect because imagination fills every gap. The unavailable lover becomes idealized. The uncertain relationship becomes mythologized. The painful connection becomes romanticized. And all the while, genuine love quietly waits beneath the noise, often overlooked because it does not produce emotional chaos intense enough to dominate the nervous system. The emotionally integrated woman eventually sees through this illusion. She understands that desire alone proves nothing about emotional compatibility. Some of the strongest attractions emerge precisely where psychological wounds remain deepest. This realization gives her enormous emotional power. Now she no longer chases people who awaken anxiety while calling it chemistry. She no longer confuses emotional unpredictability with depth. She stops seeking validation through obsessive pursuit and begins seeking emotional alignment instead. And emotional alignment feels radically different. There is attraction, yes, but also peace. There is desire, but without emotional self-destruction attached to it. There is passion, but not at the cost of self-worth. This balance represents psychological maturity. The Stoics spoke often about desire as a force capable of enslaving consciousness when left unexamined. Marcus Aurelius warned that uncontrolled craving distorts perception itself. The mind exaggerates what it desperately wants while ignoring what it genuinely needs. This distortion defines many modern relationships completely. People crave emotional stimulation while starving emotionally for peace. They chase validation while longing secretly for authentic connection. They worship intensity while fearing intimacy. And intimacy requires something desire alone cannot provide: presence. Presence means seeing another person clearly instead of projecting fantasies onto them. Presence means loving reality instead of emotional possibility. Presence means choosing someone consciously rather than becoming psychologically possessed by longing. This is why love often feels quieter than obsession. Love sees, desire imagines, love accepts, desire idealizes, love stabilizes, desire destabilizes, and yet many people fear love precisely because it removes illusion. Real love exposes unresolved wounds gently but honestly. It asks people to stop performing, stop chasing emotional highs compulsively, stop confusing suffering with meaning. The integrated feminine woman eventually becomes capable of this kind of love because she no longer needs desire to validate her worth. She stops measuring value through obsession, stops needing emotional chaos to feel alive, stops interpreting unpredictability as proof of soulmate connection. Now her attraction becomes wiser, softer, more conscious, because she finally understands the hidden reason desire feels stronger than love. Desire excites the ego, but love transforms the soul. And transformation frightens the ego far more than excitement ever could. Excitement is temporary. It can be controlled, chased, dramatized, performed. But transformation demands surrender. It asks a person to release old identities, old fantasies, old emotional addictions. And most people resist this surrender unconsciously because the ego would rather suffer inside familiar desire than dissolve inside authentic love. Carl Jung understood that love becomes psychologically dangerous the moment it begins threatening illusion. The ego survives through projection. It wants fantasy, certainty, possession, validation. But authentic love strips these fantasies away slowly until two people stand emotionally exposed before one another without masks. This exposure terrifies emotionally fragmented people because real intimacy does not allow endless performance. The emotionally integrated woman eventually recognizes how often desire feeds illusion rather than truth. She notices how men become obsessed with what they cannot fully possess emotionally, how distance magnifies attraction, how emotional unavailability creates projection powerful enough to feel like destiny. But she also notices something deeper. The men consumed by desire are often not seeing her clearly at all. They are seeing their own longing reflected back at them, their own emptiness, their own fantasy of completion. This is why obsession can disappear suddenly once emotional reality replaces imagination. The projected fantasy collapses beneath ordinary human truth. Real intimacy reveals imperfections, emotional needs, boundaries, vulnerability. And the ego, addicted to fantasy, often loses interest once projection weakens. But love deepens when illusion dissolves. That is the difference. Desire rooted in projection feeds upon distance and uncertainty. Love rooted in consciousness grows through presence and truth. One seeks emotional stimulation, the other seeks emotional integration. And integration changes attraction permanently. You begin understanding why emotionally awakened women often appear calmer in love. They no longer chase intensity compulsively because they recognize how easily intensity can become emotional addiction. They stop glorifying emotional suffering, stop romanticizing unavailable people, stop confusing longing with destiny. Instead, they seek reciprocity, depth, emotional safety without losing attraction. This balance becomes possible only after confronting unconscious wounds honestly. Carl Jung believed individuation requires integrating the shadow rather than remaining controlled by it unconsciously. The shadow often drives desire through hidden emotional hunger, fear of abandonment, need for validation, unresolved shame, emotional deprivation. Until these wounds become conscious, relationships remain psychological reenactments rather than authentic connection. This is why some people repeatedly desire emotionally unavailable partners despite immense suffering. The unconscious mind keeps recreating emotional scenarios matching old wounds because familiarity feels psychologically compelling, even when painful. But awareness interrupts repetition, and the integrated woman becomes deeply aware. Now she notices when desire emerges strongest around emotional inconsistency, notices when anxiety masquerades as chemistry, notices how fantasy grows whenever emotional clarity disappears. This awareness protects her from losing herself inside obsession. The Stoics understood that freedom begins when emotional cravings stop controlling perception. Seneca wrote that people become prisoners of whatever they desperately crave. Desire distorts judgment because the ego exaggerates the value of what feels emotionally scarce. Scarcity creates obsession. Peace creates clarity. This is why emotionally mature love often feels less cinematic but more life-changing. It does not constantly destabilize identity. It does not require emotional suffering to sustain attraction. It allows both people to remain connected to themselves while loving one another deeply. And this kind of love heals rather than consumes. The integrated feminine woman eventually chooses healing over emotional addiction. She no longer seeks validation through being intensely desired by emotionally unavailable men. She no longer needs obsession to confirm her worth. She understands that genuine intimacy requires emotional availability, not merely emotional intensity. This understanding transforms her energy completely. Now she moves through relationships differently. She stops chasing people incapable of presence, stops begging emotionally detached men for clarity, stops sacrificing nervous system peace for temporary emotional highs. Instead, she chooses alignment, and aligned women become powerful because they are no longer controlled by unconscious longing. The hidden reason desire feels stronger than love is because desire often activates wounds, fantasies, and ego hunger simultaneously. Love, however, asks something much more difficult: emotional truth. And emotional truth demands vulnerability, patience, responsibility, and self-awareness. It asks people to stop escaping into fantasy and begin seeing one another clearly. Most people fear this level of intimacy initially, but the emotionally awakened woman no longer fears it because she finally understands something life-changing. Desire may consume the mind, but only love can free the soul. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.